Hey there, guys. What's going on? And welcome to the Barbells and BJJ podcast yet again with your host, Mr. George Cresswell. And today, for our first podcast of 2024, we have an amazing and very, very important, in my opinion, topic in store that I very much enjoyed doing the research for this episode for. Research in the form of reading, not research in the form of rigorous scientific studies. But anyway, we're going to be talking about rigorous scientific studies today anyway. But I hope you guys had an amazing new year, celebrating another successful revolution around the sun, as we love to do. But getting straight into the episode today, we're going to be talking about the menstrual cycle and any potential negative impacts it may have, particularly on strength and resistance training. So this was a question that was asked to me in a Q&A that I done last year, whilst I was away on holiday, where I asked you guys for your questions that you would like me to answer. And obviously we had the main Q&A episode before the end of the year. It was my last episode of last year. So I mentioned in that episode that we had to take some of the questions away, this one in particular, to do a full-blown episode on, because it turned into a massive sort of, study in and of itself. And I realized that this was going to be, it's going to make the episode way too long. Like the previous episode was already 2 hours, over 2 hours, answering those questions. It was going to make the episode way, way too long to talk about this in the depth that I wanted to from the research that I had done. So I decided to take it out of that episode and create this episode, which you're listening to now, where I can talk about it in more detail. Now, I know some people are probably going to criticize me being a white man talking about the menstrual cycle and the patriarchy, and oh my God, but I hope that you guys are going to understand that I did try to do my best to give this topic the respect that it requires. I feel you're going to see that in the depths of the research that I have gone to in this episode. I haven't just said that, a brief description of the menstrual cycle and, just spouted my uneducated previous opinion on it. No, we actually gone away. We looked at several studies. I've read several studies, which will all be referenced in the show notes below, and many of which we're going to be talking about now to give you guys a full picture. Because I'll be the first to say, it wasn't a topic that I had a lot of background knowledge on. And as we will come to see, I do think it's a topic that a lot of men don't have a lot of background knowledge on, especially if you're a male coach, whether you be a PT or a sports coach. I think it's very, very important to understand this process and some of the effects it has on female athletes. As we'll get into in some of the later studies that we'll be talking about later on in the episode, it's going to be very, very important to understand, especially if you are a male coach, of female clients if you're a PT, or female athletes if you're a coach. Okay. So now we're going to be going into a little bit about what the menstrual cycle is. And the menstrual cycle is basically just a cycle that prepares a woman for pregnancy, right? That's basically what it is. It has 2 distinct phases, or 3 phases, depending on how you see ovulation as a phase, which in my opinion it is. Typically, as we're going through this, I'll be using ovulation and ovulatory phase probably quite interchangeably, but obviously ovulation isn't necessarily just one day, as we'll be getting into now. So the menstrual cycle revolves around fluctuations in sex hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone. There's some others as well, but those are the main 2 we're going to be focusing on throughout the context of this part of the discussion and throughout later studies that we'll be going into. And these tend to have effects on different aspects of the body. So estrogen, for example, has effects on the cardiovascular system, on substrate metabolism, and in the brain. And then progesterone then can also have effects on thermoregulation, which actually explains why one of the previous measures that was used, and it's not so much used anymore and shouldn't be used, but was basal body temperature fluctuations, was used to predict ovulation before. Ventilation and substrate utilization, okay? So the hormones have differing effects on each other. Estrogen and progesterone have opposite effects on the body. But then the menstrual cycle is often, there we go, just get my notes up. The menstrual cycle is often broken down, as I said, into 2 to 3 distinct phases. And you have the follicular phase, then you have ovulation, or the ovulatory phase, and then you have the luteal phase, okay? So the follicular phase tends to be on days 1 to 9. And there can be a range, okay? It's not necessarily rigidly within these days. It varies widely on an individual basis, okay? The follicular phase can be potentially up to 22 days long, as we'll get into in a little bit. It's mediated by an increase, or it's mediated by the hormone known as follicle stimulating hormone, where this hormone causes an increase in estrogen, which then estrogen leads to an increase in the secretion of a hormone known as luteinizing hormone. And it's the characterization of ovulation, which marks the end of this phase, is 1 day post what we call a luteinizing hormone surge, which is where we see a drastic increase, a very rapid increase in this luteinizing hormone, and that signals the start of ovulation 1 day later. So this follicular phase is also sometimes known as the menstrual phase, which is when you have menstrual bleeding and cramps and stuff like that, okay? The ovulation phase then, or ovulation, tends to be on days 10 to 14. Again, tends to because it's just an average, okay? It doesn't mean that it's going to be rigidly on days 10 to 14 every single cycle for every single female on the planet. That's not how the menstrual cycle works, and that's a massive misconception of the menstrual cycle, okay? And then ovulation marks, obviously, the beginning of the ovulatory phase, and it's where the follicle releases the ovum, which is transformed into what's called the corpus luteum, or is known as a yellow body. This increases the secretion of progesterone, and that signals the start then of the luteal phase, okay? Finally then, with the luteal phase, it typically lasts sort of 2 weeks, and it's typically on days 15 to 28. Again, it can vary widely. It can be shorter. It can be a little bit longer, okay? It can come in on earlier days if the follicular phase isn't as long for this cycle, okay? And it's characterized by this progesterone being increased as it supports the lining of the uterus, which is what's known as the endothelium in preparation for pregnancy, okay? This is until the embryo can create the placenta, which is what will happen when you get pregnant, and then you the menstrual cycle actually stops. You stop getting a period and stuff like that, because if you are pregnant, then you stop getting a period. Then towards the end of this phase, the progesterone drops, and as a result, this support for the endothelium drops, and as a result, you get the menstrual bleeding. Okay, and that signals the start of the menstrual cycle all over again. As estrogen drops, follicle stimulating hormone increases, and the cycle repeats. Okay, so on average, it's about 28 days, but it can vary widely from person to person. Okay, it can be a little bit shorter, it can be a little bit longer. Everyone's cycle will be slightly different, and no two cycles really are the same in terms of length. They can be, but in terms of length, they can vary from cycle to cycle in the same person. Okay, so no cycle is absolutely rigid at 28 days for every single cycle that will happen across the course of a female's life. Okay, so basically a little bit of a summary of the hormones involved in the menstrual cycle and different phases. The follicular phase is characterized by low estrogen, low progesterone, and obviously low concentrations at the others. Ovulatory phase, you tend to have high estrogen and low progesterone, and then the luteal phase is high in both, and then they both drop down to low, and it repeats again. So the main findings of the study, which I'm talking about here, which goes all the way back to 2005, it's by Constantini and colleagues, is that muscular strength seemed largely unaffected by the menstrual cycle at all phases. And this is going to be a consistent theme that we see. It's not the full picture by any means. Stick around for the full episode to get the full context of what we're talking about. But largely, at least physiologically and due to hormone changes, it largely unaffects sporting performance. There's another study which I've included here called Birch and Riley, by the authors Birch and Riley, sorry. They noticed a small increase in isometric lifting strength, maximal isometric lifting strength in the luteal phase of a magnitude of 8%. At the midpoint of the luteal phase in the evening session only. So basically these guys, they measured, I think they measured changes in hormones and also maximal isometric lifting strength and also muscular endurance at 6 a.m. in the morning and 6 p.m. in the evening, midway through the follicular phase and midway through the luteal phase. That's how they measured this. There was no change or effect for muscular endurance though whatsoever. I said it was only measured once in each phase of the cycle, in the morning and in the evening. So then we're looking at hormonal effects. And as I said, estrogen and progesterone have opposite effects on the body. One of the things which these guys highlighted is that estrogen potentially has what's called an inotropic effect, which means it modifies the speed of muscle contraction. Okay. This has been shown, or rather this was suggested to peak in the late follicular ovulatory phase, so in that transition period, potentially up to an 11% change in magnitude, which signals a drastic shift from favoring low force production in the muscles to favoring high force production. So that's very, very important. That was a very, very important observation, which I picked up from this study. So then the other thing then is that progesterone, with the opposite effects of estrogen, potentially negative due to sedative-like effects, hence why there may be diminished performance during the luteal phase. Obviously, this is going to be highly individual. Responses that we'll see are highly individual. This is potentially something to consider. Obviously, these findings from all the way back, or this stays from all the way back in 2005. A lot of research, which we're going to be going into a little bit later. This is just giving you a background, really, on what sort of research has been done. A lot of research more modern nowadays. In fact, there was a umbrella review that came out as I was doing the research, or as I was doing the reading for this episode from Stuart McGill and colleagues. So that was like a sort of like what they call it, a match made in heaven or something like that. It was very, very interesting to see that an umbrella review, which is a very, very large publication, it's a review of reviews, came out as I was doing this episode, as I was doing the research for this episode. So, for example, doing this, trainings where greater performance and work capacity is required may be better done in the late follicular, where the menstrual bleeding has eventually subsided, into the ovulatory phase and early luteal phase. However, it's unclear as to the magnitude of what benefit this would bring. Okay, and this will be a running theme as well. Spoiler alert, there's really no strong evidence to say that we should be planning based on the menstrual cycle. But anyway, I'm going to go to the next one now. And this goes back even further to 2003. This is to do with concentrations of bioavailable hormones, such as what's called estradiol, which is another word for estrogen, and testosterone. They looked at free test and total test, so bioavailable test. They looked at muscular strength and bioavailable estradiol and testosterone. This is from Elliott and colleagues in 2003. And they did show that estradiol, which is estrogen, and progesterone did vary significantly across phases of the cycle, as we would expect, because obviously the cycle is characterized and marked by changes in these hormones. However, total and bioavailable testosterone did not differ. This was a very small sample size. It was only 7, but they did not find any detectable differences or any significant differences in changes in anabolic hormones such as testosterone. So that's an important background as well, because testosterone, as I said, is a very anabolic hormone that has positive effects on resistance training. So we're going to skip all the way forward now, 15, 17 years, all the way forward to 2020. So we're looking at a study here from Weidauer and colleagues. So I forgot to make a note of the actual title of the study, but basically one of the main findings they observed is they actually observed diminished exercise performance in the early follicular phase. Now, just based on what goes on in the early follicular phase, which is when you have the highest amount of cramps, backaches, headaches, pain, sensations, menstrual bleeding, stuff like that, this is not necessarily unexpected. Okay. They also had the greatest measures of irritability, which if you consider everything else that's going on, it's not really surprising. As I said, menstrual cramps, stomach pain, feelings of fatigue, lower back pain, all noted to be highest in magnitude in the early follicular phase as opposed to the ovulatory and luteal phases. Okay. Kind of what we'd expect. The luteal phase has just ended and all the negative cascade effects of the early follicular phase have begun. They did, however, suggest that the performance decrements were likely not hormone related. Okay, important for this, the subject size, or rather the participant size, was 50, and they had 25 on a regular menstrual cycle, and they had 25 on a pill cycle. Okay, so that's when people are taking oral contraceptive cycle, and they did see no significant differences between either cycle conditions, so between the regular menstrual cycle and the oral contraceptive cycle in performance, despite significant differences in the hormones, despite significant differences in the hormones due to the contraception, which has effects on female hormones. That's what it's designed to do, okay? So that's very, very telling, really, is that, and this will be a theme that we get into a little bit later, is that the performance decrements may not be purely physiologically based. Okay, it might not be because of fluctuations in hormones, your exercise performance goes down. That's actually quite unlikely. Okay, there's more to it than that, and there's more understanding to be gained on this topic from that. But that is something that that is not something without merit. Okay, and what I mean by that is it's not necessarily pure merit to saying, oh, I'm on my cycle, so my performance goes down. It's just an absolute. Not much evidence for that whatsoever. As I said, this supports the assertion that these hormones, there we go. Supports the assertion that these hormones have no negative effect on skeletal muscle itself. As I said, though performance may be diminished in the early follicular phase. relative to the other phases. So that might be something, if you are a coach, for example, and you know your client is currently in the early follicular phase, you may tailor their sessions accordingly. Okay, and you may tailor your training style accordingly. We'll talk about how you can tailor your training style and empathy and stuff like that a little bit later. They also pointed out that it could potentially be due to iron losses associated with menstrual bleeding. Okay, this was based on observations from others of the benefits of iron supplementation, and also that 30% of female athletes on average are iron deficient. There's further studies needed on this, and there may be further reading on my part, which maybe even you guys can help me out with if you've happened to gone down a rabbit hole with regards to this like I did. But at the present time when this study was published in 2020, there was further studies needed on this topic. So that's something to consider as well. I want to start creating this theme, okay, that just because you're on your menstrual cycle, and again, this is not me trying to speak out of turn with regards to the menstrual cycle, it's very easy to point out that I don't suffer with menstrual cycle related symptoms, obviously. So people might be like, oh, who does this guy think he's to talk on it? Well, A, I'm a personal trainer. B, somebody asked me. I felt that this was an important question to give due diligence, and I'll be going into more things a little bit later that make this seem like I'm being a lot less of a douchebag a little bit later, okay? So, when we're looking at another study now from Pallavi and colleagues, this was in 2017. So apologies, this is a little bit out of order, but it's just the order that I transcribed them from my notes. So they looked at muscular strength and fatigue in various stages of the menstrual cycle. And it was a prospective study. They had 100 participants, 100 women of 18 to 24 years old, and they were deemed to have regular menstrual cycles. And it was on average about 29 days. It was up as high as 32 down to 26. Okay, so again, you have that inter-individual variability. That's what I meant to say. For a minimum of 6 months prior to the study. So that's quite a good criteria, okay? They made sure that every woman had a regular menstrual cycle up until the point of the study from 6 months before. Good starting point. However, and this is where we're going to start getting into some of the methodological considerations with this study. This is how they labeled the phases of the menstrual cycle, okay? Phase 1 was classed as the menstrual phase. Phase 2 was classed as the follicular phase, and phase 3 was classed as the luteal phase, okay? So they observed significant increases in work done in the follicular phase relative to the menstrual and luteal phases. They also observed that in the menstrual phase had the highest levels of fatigue relative to the luteal, and then finally the follicular phase, okay? Problem is, and also I should point out, is that they concluded that hormone variation affects muscular strength in different MC phases, okay? That's not necessarily a bad conclusion to draw from the data, okay? However, there's two key problems that I want to highlight with this study that, in my opinion, reduce the validity and reliability of the results and the usefulness of this study's results quite a bit. In that, A, sex hormones were not measured. Sex hormones were not measured. That's very, very important. If you're going to make an assertion regarding sex hormones, then you should measure them, okay? Just for sake of showing that there's significant changes in the sex hormones, okay? It just helps back up your argument even further if you've actually gone and measured them and shown the data with them. But also, they did not mention when ovulatory phase occurred, and ovulation was not recorded. Now, the menstrual phase is a phase of the follicular phase itself. So labeling them as separate it skews the line as to where ovulation fits in, okay? And then you start casting doubt on whether these females actually had regular cycles leading up to it. So again, I don't like the way that they've measured their cycles and how they've labeled how they measured the cycles, okay? Because the menstrual phase itself, when menstrual bleeding occurs, is part of the follicular phase. So taking that and then making the follicular phase leading up to everything beyond ovulation just seems weird. And as a result, obviously, they didn't measure things, as far as I know, like luteinizing hormone and stuff like that. So they had no benchmark of when ovulation occurred. So how can you be sure that the phase has changed? Also, you didn't measure sex hormones. So there's quite a lot of methodological concerns with this study, but I thought it was important to mention. This is why I question the conclusions and the validity of these results. So going on to the next one, where we are looking at a study, if it'll come up. I'm not sure how to pronounce this person's name, but I think it's Kose. It's Kose with the two dots above the O. I'm not sure how to exactly pronounce it. This was in 2018, and they looked at the effect on Menstrual Cycle on Anaerobic Capacity and Muscular Strength. Okay, it's quite a good study in my opinion. So it was in advanced athletes, which is important to consider as well. They took 10 advanced kickboxing athletes, and by advanced we mean with greater than 7 years of training experience, and they were an average age of 21. Okay, so most of these studies are done in relatively young populations. Pardon me. They looked at maximal strength through 1 rep max. They looked at anaerobic capacity and power through the Wingate test, which are 2 very good tests to measure strength and power. At the measurements, they looked at, there they are. So they took, and this was quite like this, they took the 2nd and 3rd day of menstrual bleeding as their first measure. They then looked at the 8th and 9th days of the follicular phase. And then finally, they looked at the days midway through the luteal phase, the 2nd and 23rd days, okay? They observed no changes in maximal strength, strength endurance, time to exhaustion at any menstrual cycle time point. So whether it was in the menstrual bleeding, whether it was in the follicular phase towards the end when menstrual bleeding has subsided, and then post-ovulation in the luteal phase. They also measured it. There was no changes. There was no negative decrements at any point across the phases. So it intends to imply that the menstrual cycle does not affect performance. Okay, so there's quite a few things that I want to talk about with this regarding it now. Okay, there's other things to consider, in my opinion. If I can get my notepad to move my notes. There we go. So when we're looking at this, one thing to consider is that the sample size is very small and very specific. Obviously, it's advanced athletes and there was only 10 of them. So it's very, very considered. It has a low generalizability. However, it is good at informing on the topic, okay? Because they looked at various different outcome measures. They were very rigorous in how they went about it. So yeah, I like to think that the results are quite valid, although the statistical power of the study can be quite low because of the low sample size. So generalizing from just this one study may be inappropriate, okay? However, another thing to consider, in my opinion, is training experience. They were advanced athletes. Now, the population, or rather the participants in an earlier study that we talked about, were just labeled as recreationally active. So there's a distinction there between training experience and the level of physical ability of the participants, okay? So there's a difference that was created between recreational and advanced training. And maybe, for example, there was no changes observed due to things like mental toughness and fortitude, due to many, many years of very rigorous training with the menstrual cycle, okay? Could be. Obviously, there's further studies to warrant that, but I would argue that training experience does play a role versus people that have less training experience, okay? And less in an environment where they put more so the focus on performance, okay? They're focusing on pushing you and pushing you to be better, okay? Pushing you to be a lot better, pushing you to be your best for competition, okay? You know, not just to get that little bit better every single time for, you know, better self-esteem and stuff like that. No, you look to be the best you could be. These are advanced athletes, okay? But then finally, and then this one I would like to think it was a very positive and does help out with it because there is quite a lot of evidence. One of the studies came out from one of my professors when I was at Swansea University regarding this. I was quite, you know, pleasantly surprised to see one of my old lecturers' names on a paper that I'm going to talk about now. And that is the coaching environment, okay? And I would like to think that this is positive and that helped these athletes with regards to training with their menstrual cycle, okay? So, in my opinion, I hope that would manifest in support for female athletes in discussing and dealing with negative effects of the MC, viewed as important to maintaining good training and performances. Okay, now we're going to look at 2 studies. The first one is by Findlay and colleagues, and they explored female athletes' experiences and perceptions of the menstrual cycle in relation to its impact on sports performance, okay? They looked at 15 female rugby players, and the way they looked at this is they had verbatim transcribed interviews, okay? So this was more of a qualitative approach, okay? We were looking to generate themes. We're not looking to generate numbers. We're looking to generate more themes that we can talk about, okay? Because this is a subjective topic, okay? People deal with this in different ways. However, there are different dimensions of thought and stats that we can draw on from this. For example, 93% of them reported menstrual cycle related symptoms. 33% reported heavy menstrual bleeding, and 67% considered the menstrual cycle symptoms negatively or to negatively affect performance. And as a result, 67% of them self-medicated to help alleviate symptoms like pain and discomfort. Okay, this is not uncommon. From this, the researchers in this study were able to generate 4 broad themes, or dimensions as they called them. One of which, pardon me, I'll go through all 4 of them now. The first one of them was the psychological and physiological symptoms, okay? This is things like dysmenorrhea, reduced energy levels, worry and distraction, and fluctuating emotions, emotional and mood disturbances, okay? So this all falls under the physiological and psychological symptoms of the menstrual cycle. Then they had another broad category, another broad dimension titled impact, okay? And this is the perceived impact of menstruation on daily life and also performance, okay? Then they had this another dimension called resolution. I'm getting onto the one which I think is very, very important in a minute. Resolution being the methods and approaches to dealing with menstrual cycle related concerns, including accepting or adapting symptom management. So self-medication is basically what that comes down to. But finally, the one that's really, really important was the 4th dimension, which was support. Okay, support for the athletes. Available support and comfortability in discussing menstrual cycle related issues. Okay, so they identified that, the 4th dimension of support, as being an important construct, so to speak, within helping female athletes dealing with the menstrual cycle in relation to sporting performance. And as I said, it wasn't a case of the athletes don't experience the negative effects of the menstrual cycle, just that they may be better equipped to deal with them, is how I feel. This can potentially come in the form of good physical and mental conditioning. Okay, as I said, building up their mental toughness and fortitude through their conditioning and through their training. However, I would also hope that good support networks were available and are available. Okay, and this comes through their coaches and teammates. To expand on this, we're going to look at a study now from Brown, Knight, and Forrest from a year later in 2021. And this is where they examined 2 things. The elite female athletes of the MC, of the menstrual cycle, focused on training and competition impact. And then finally, the openness of conversation pertaining to the menstrual cycle with coaching and support staff. Okay, so these are 2 very important themes as we'll get onto. So they looked at 17 elite level female athletes, all experienced natural menstrual cycle symptoms, okay? So some of the things that they experienced less motivation to train, that went down. Mood disturbance went up, okay? Anxieties around training and competition. So this goes down to things like weight cutting, performance impacts, worrying if they're going to be distracted during competition season. They all went up, okay? So this is very, very, negative for their performance, okay? However, the athletes showed an openness regarding menstrual cycle related discussions with teammates, with other females. However, with other athletes. However, they were hesitant to discuss it with male coaches. Okay. And this is where one of the big things, in my opinion, that can potentially derail a lot of coach-client relationships is the coach not, and also obviously coach-athlete relationships as well, is not understanding actually how the menstrual cycle works, the individual changes and the individuality of the cycle, how it can change across cycles, how it differs from person to person, and also how the extent of the negative effects it can have, not just physiologically with the hormone changes, but how it impacts psychologically and how that psychological impact can have potential negative impacts on the physical performance, okay? And also training, things like desire to train, arousal, and the pleasure response from training and stuff like that. We'll be getting into those in a little bit as well. So this, in my opinion, underpins, and in the opinions of the authors, underpins a need for thorough education on the menstrual cycle for all involved in the athlete development. That's coaches, that's any support staff, anybody that's involved in any capacity in athlete development should have a thorough understanding and a thorough education of the menstrual cycle. And as I said, especially in intimate male to female coaching relationships where it can easily be derailed if there's perceived lack of empathy and stuff like that. Not necessarily saying that that everybody needs to feel sorry and go into that whole victimhood, woe is me kind of thing, but just having empathy for what, say, female athletes would be going through at certain stages of their cycle and how that may negatively impact trainings and how you may need to tailor trainings accordingly. Okay. And this is important to consider. I got some stats to break down here now from elite football leagues across the world, okay, where it does matter because 72% of head coaches in women's football on average are male. And this is from 2021. This is based on stats from femalecoachingnetwork.com. Okay, that's where I've got these stats from if you want to go read them yourself. Okay, so according to them, they have 93% in the Frauen Bundesliga are male. That's a German league. 90% in the NWSL are male. That's USA. 83% in Division 1 Feminine. That's France. They're all male. 78% in the Primera Division were male. That is in Spain. It's also known as Liga F. Okay. 73% in the Women's Champions League are male. 73% of coaches. This is all coaching staff. Okay. Europe, that's a European league. Internationally is 59%. And then finally 44% in the FAWSL are male in England. Okay, so there are a lot of men in positions where they are coaching women at the highest level, and therefore a lack of understanding could potentially lead to decrements in performance, and also decrements and negative implications on the coach-athlete relationship, which is very, very important. This can all stem from a basic lack of knowledge and a basic lack of empathy, okay, and a lack of understanding about how to actually program, and maybe certain changes that might need to be made to programming, just slight changes in order to account for certain changes across the menstrual cycle, okay? Again, no need to necessarily overhaul entire training systems because of the menstrual cycle, as we'll get onto in a minute. We're about to get onto that umbrella review I mentioned in a minute. But it is important to consider, okay? Oh, we got one more to go before we get there. So there's another study here from Dasa et al. This is from 2021. They assessed the effect of the menstrual cycle on muscular power. So it's a prospective cohort study with a total of 29 participants completing the studies. Sample size is quite small, admittedly. Sample size is quite small, especially in comparison to the prospective study we had earlier with 100 participants. As we can see, the participant number isn't everything. There's also significant issues that we had with the methodology in that study. They had 8 eumenoric and 21 on contraceptives. Okay, so that's the total of 29. They did have an initial much larger participant number, but for various reasons, the participants had to withdraw from the study. Okay, it will cut down from 55 down to eventually 29 that finished it, and some had to be excluded from what we call post hoc analysis because of their failure to report the onset of menstruation. So there's various challenges that these authors run into. This wasn't necessarily methodological concerns, okay, because these are things that you can't always account for in studies, okay? This is a limitation of the study because it drastically reduced the population size, drastically reduced the sample size. However, it wasn't necessarily something that they can control for because you cannot force people to stay in studies when they don't want to, okay? Every person that's within a study, and this happened in my dissertation as well when we were doing studies with the Swansea netball team, okay? You cannot force them to stay in a study if they don't want to. Every participant has the right to withdraw from a study from any time for any reason and their data not to be included, okay? So that's just something that happens. It's called attrition rates, the rate at which participants don't complete the study, okay? It differs depending on what field you're in and what the study protocols are, okay? So it's just something that happens. However, they looked at maximal hand grip strength, they looked at 20-meter sprint, they looked at counter movement jump, they looked at pneumatic leg press, and they tested them across 6 weeks. So it's a decent time frame. Think about it. The longer a study goes on, the less control you can have because it has to be a more free-living study. Okay, it has to be a more free living study because to control people, and their entire lifestyle for several weeks at a time, they've got to be compensated in a big way, especially when you consider that people have jobs potentially, people have other things they want to go do. You're asking them to take a massive break from their life in order to do this study. If you're doing something like a metabolic ward study or something like that occasionally you have to let go of some control as much as we don't want to. Okay, we want tight control over the variables when we're doing scientific studies. We need that. However, it can't always be done. It's not always feasible. Okay. However, they noticed no statistical differences for phases of the MC on the outcome variables, suggests that the MC does not alter acute strength and power in high-level team sport athletes. However, as I said, only 55 participants were 55 participants were recruited initially, but only 29 completed the study by the end. And as I said, some of them that would have completed the study had to be removed from post hoc analysis, which is basically subsequent analysis, where you look to really isolate specifics, specifics at a certain time, how much things varied at a certain time point, if you did see a change in the luteal phase, when did it occur, stuff like that. They had to be excluded from that because they failed to report the onset of menstruation. So again, you do run into limitations when it comes to studies. So now we're moving on to the massive study. It was a massive umbrella review that came out literally, as I said, as I was doing the initial work for this episode. It's by Colenso Semple and colleagues, and as I said, one of the most well-renowned voices in the sports science field, Stuart McGill. No, not Stuart McGill. Not Stuart McGill. Stu Phillips. Stu Phillips, sorry, not Stuart McGill. Stuart McGill's the back expert guy. But Stu Phillips. Stu Phillips was another key name on the paper. And this is, as I said, a systematic umbrella review. So basically what they did is there were various systematic reviews and associated meta-analyses that had already been done on this topic. And basically they took those, what is thought to normally be a consensus and made a consensus of the consensus. Okay, that's why you call it an umbrella. So it's like a meta-analysis is a study of studies, or a systematic review is sort of like how you take the data from those studies and put it in a way that's understandable. But and what they did is they then basically pooled the results of those together, the 5 that were available, with 3 associated meta-analyses, and made a massive review. Okay, so the total participant number was 2,144. But basically, to summarize this study, is that it is currently premature to conclude that short-term fluctuations in reproductive hormones appreciably influence acute exercise performance or long-term strength or hypertrophy adaptations to resistance exercise training. Okay, it's just premature. Okay, based on the evidence that we have, the quality and the quantity of evidence that we have, it's premature to start overhauling entire training systems based on the short-term changes to do with the menstrual cycle. Okay, and there's obviously we talk about quite a bit of evidence that shows that the reasons that people may have for wanting to overhaul the system, the evidence is quite strong to show that the menstrual cycle doesn't have significant physiological effects that warrant a need of training system overhauls. Okay. Doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be taken into account or shouldn't be taken into account. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. Just we don't need to overhaul the system because of it. So the overall quality of evidence in this study analyzed, come on. Oh, why is this not working? There we go. So as I said, the overall quality of evidence was low to moderate. Okay. So the way they took they looked at the procedures that the various systematic reviews and meta-analyses had done, and they quantified them and basically found that the majority of the evidence available, whether it was for or against, whether there was evidence showing that there was an effect of the menstrual cycle, although there was no compelling evidence that there was, basically most of it was moderate, some of it was low. Okay. So then, as I said, the total participants across the 5 systematic reviews was 2,144, and they looked at 3 key areas that I'm going to look at now. So all the 3 key areas that I took from this paper, again, you can go read the entire thing if you want. I'll try and link it down below. There was the importance of comprehensive menstrual cycle detection methods. That's the first one we're going to be going through. Does the menstrual cycle phase influence acute muscular strength performance? That's the biggest one for obviously this podcast here. And then critical evaluation of menstrual cycle based training. Okay, so these are 3 big topics that we're going to be going into now. So menstrual cycle phase based training, if I can get this to scroll up, please. There we go. Relies on the prediction of determining each individual's menstrual cycle phase accurately. Okay. And the way you do this is by getting an accurate measure of ovulation. That's the way you do it, because that is the distinction point between menstrual cycle phases. So, as I said, ovulation divides it into its distinct phases, and this is characterized by that surge in luteinizing hormone that I mentioned a little while ago. Okay, so on a day in the menstrual cycle, just as the follicular phase is coming to an end, luteinizing hormone surges due to the increasing estrogen content, or due to the increasing estrogen secretion. And after this surge, one day post this surge, ovulation occurs. The ovum is released. Okay? As I said, phase duration, and they mentioned that phase duration is highly individual. So they noted here that the phases can vary to 10 to 22 days for the follicular phase and 7 to 17 days for the luteal phase. So that's what we mean. No two cycles for every individual are the same, and potentially no two cycles across individuals are the same either. Cycles can vary from person to person, and cycles can vary from cycle to cycle. Okay? It's important, especially if you don't have an understanding of the menstrual cycle, to bear this in mind. A lot of people, myself included, before I went and done the reading for this topic, was under the impression that the menstrual cycle was just rigid, 28 days, and I didn't even know really too much about the follicular and luteal phases before this episode, okay, before going away and doing the reading. I was very, very ignorant of this. But it's very, very important, guys, that you understand that the menstrual cycle can vary in length quite significantly, and the phase lengths can vary quite significantly from cycle to cycle and from woman to woman, okay? Especially important to consider, as I said, if you're a coach. Women, as I said, likely know this inherently. You guys may be listening, likely know this just from, obviously, your experiences with your own cycles, okay? That's where it can be a little bit of a disconnect with men because we don't have menstrual cycles, okay? I know there's a lot of people out there, as I call idiots, that would like to convince you otherwise, but men don't menstruate, okay? Men don't menstruate. Women menstruate. Men don't. So it can be hard to appreciate this sometimes unless you have a thorough education and understanding of it, and also if you're coming at it with empathy, okay? So, as I said, past studies, the problem is that some past studies have assumed that the menstrual cycle just relies on this 28 days, it's perfectly rigid and perfectly consistent, when it's not. So there's previous methodological considerations that we have to take into account when we are analyzing studies, okay? And then also there's the tests for ovulation. So the best way to test for ovulation is either with a blood or urine test, okay? You're looking for the ovulation surge in luteinizing hormone, which is where we're looking for a surge from about 20, and this is what we call milli-international units per milliliter of blood. So you're looking at 20 going up to 100. So that's a 5-fold increase. Okay, that's that surge we're talking about, okay? Kits can detect this from as low as 22, okay? So you can detect this surge quite easily with relatively cheap and non-invasive kits, okay? And this is why when you're doing studies, obviously you don't necessarily need to do this if you're just a PT in the gym or whatever, but it's important to understand what actually characterizes ovulation. When you're reading studies into this stuff, okay, it's important to understand that the way that ovulation should be measured in scientific studies is via this blood or urinary luteinizing hormone test. Because another way that it's been done before is with basal body temperature. If you remember back at the start of this episode, I mentioned that progesterone can cause increases in body temperature. It affects thermoregulation. Now, progesterone can have effects on thermoregulation in the realm of 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit, or about 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius. So this is another way that ovulation has been characterized before in past studies. Okay, mainly because it's convenient and it's non-invasive. Okay, however, there is a problem. In the study of 98 women, all the way back in 1981 by Bowman, okay, basal body temperature only coincided with ovulation, obviously when it was compared with the luteinizing hormone surge, in 22% of menstrual cycles, okay? It is a very, very unreliable and invalid now measure of ovulation, and it should not really be used. So a lot of previous studies, or some previous studies, have used this measure, okay? And it's important to consider that, again, it affects things like estimation of cycle phase. How do you know that these women were actually in the phase of the menstrual cycle that they were reported to be in, okay? It's very, very, it's a very big methodological concern, and there's reliable temperature measures can be difficult to attain at certain points due to things like sleep disturbances, stress, illness, and the general environment that you're in. Think about it, the humidity and the heat of the environment can affect your temperature to a certain extent, okay? So there's a lot of things to consider, and that's why these guys recommended not using, as has been done before, this basal body temperature measure, and instead looking for this surge in luteinizing hormone as the characterization of the beginning of ovulation, okay? So, as I said, average cycle length can be useful and insightful, okay, as well. Let's go into a comment about the overall menstrual cycle as a whole now. However, extrapolation about phase length incorrectly assumes correlation between cycle length and timing of ovulation. As I said, this is an inappropriate correlation, inappropriate observation to draw. Neither can be used as confirmation of ovulation. So therefore, cycle history should only be used to inform cycle regularity and ovulation measured via blood or urine tests. Okay? So that's where, again, it's getting very scientific now, but that's where you're looking at critiquing the previous evidence that came before. And as I said, this methodological concern is one of the things that may reduce the validity and reliability and usefulness of some of the results, which again leads to the overall quality of evidence being a little bit lower than what we would say, yeah, we need to overhaul the system for the menstrual cycle. We need to overhaul female training systems, okay? And that's why it's one of the things that we have that says that we probably shouldn't. Oh no, my battery's running low in my laptop. Oh no, my battery's running low. So, had to quickly plug in my laptop. Thank God it is actually not going to die. So yeah, currently now, as I said, thank God for editing where I can cut that bit out. We're going into section 3.2 of this umbrella review now, where we're going to be looking at, what was the title again? Oh no, I didn't make a note of the actual title. Where was it? Does the menstrual phase affect acute strength performance? So that's what we're looking at now. Where is it? There it is. Come on. Okay, so when we're looking at this, 60% of the systematic reviews, so that's 3 out of 5, because there was only 5 systematic reviews. And think about it, for a systematic review to take place, there needs to be a lot of evidence already available on a particular topic, okay? So for example, when I was doing my dissertation, I was looking at a systematic review, or rather a narrative review, of heat as a recovery modality, okay? And there was well over 100 studies. There was well over 100 studies referenced in that publication. Not all of them were to do specifically with heat and different modalities. Obviously, people have to reference background science when they're doing narrative reviews, because when you're doing a narrative review, you need to lay out the topic basically in its entirety for the full understanding of the topic at that present time. Okay, so they need to go into, what mechanisms potentially influence heat as a recovery modality. So that might be things like increased blood flow, increased temperature, effective heat shock proteins, etc., etc. Okay, I'm not going to go into the deep dive of all that. I could maybe do that in a future episode. But then they have to go through the actual effects noted by different studies on different heat modalities. So for example, one of them, I can't remember the leading author's name, but in a publication title, I know it began with turning up the heat. I can't remember what the leading author's name was, though, or is rather. They looked at heat pads, saunas, warm water or hot water immersion. What else did they look at? They looked at a bunch of different heating modalities. And obviously they got to go into the background science on all of those, and then they got to go through the actual outcome measures that were involved, potentially looking into, as I said, why with mechanisms and stuff like that. Narrative reviews and systematic reviews, typically huge publications. So for this to then include 5 of them, there's a lot of data points involved in this study. Okay, so it's very, very important to consider. So you don't tend to see systematic umbrella reviews very often. They're a typically new thing that are coming out at the minute, because it's only nowadays, think about how long the scientific process has been around, it's only nowadays we're getting enough evidence of the right type to be able to actually conduct said reviews. Okay, so that's why this coming out at seemingly at perfectly the right time was absolutely insane. But as I said, when accounting for study quality, in these meta-analyses, statistically significant differences were found in 12 out of 13 studies. However, and that's for an effect of the menstrual cycle on performance. However, they was only found in low to very low quality studies. After they adjusted and put only moderate and high quality studies into the analysis, 90% found no significant differences across menstrual cycle phases. That was 9 out of 10 publications. Okay, so that's important to consider. Obviously, within systematic reviews, they have a lot of studies referenced within them. So then they took these studies and then they looked at what happens when we only adjust for the highest quality of this information. The highest quality evidence available shows that 90% of it, at least, shows that there was no effect of the menstrual cycle on the performance. There was no significant differences. Okay. So, but then we do have possible negative effects. So there is a potential for an increase in the sensation of DOMS and greater strength losses in the early follicular phase and lowest in the mid-luteal phase. Somebody wanting to program might want to take that into account. It's not something you necessarily have to do, but it might be something to do to show that your client, that you're understanding potentially how the menstrual cycle can negatively affect their outlook on training and their, their motivation and their performance at the time. You're going to tailor that session to be a little bit easier so they can still get their session in, they still get the positive from doing the session. However, then when that sort of phase is ended, maybe that early follicular phase is ended and they've got that arousal and pleasure response from training back, then you can really push them, okay? So showing a little bit of empathy and understanding with your client, okay, or with your athlete. So, however, there was a very low sample size and it's it's relatively weak postulation, okay? The postulation overall is very weak. It might be something you want to consider, but again, it doesn't necessarily be something which you have to do, okay? So then we're looking at the other review. They also combined a regular menstrual cycle and contraceptives. And the authors highlighted this may be methodologically inappropriate due to differing effects of exogenous versus endogenous hormones on female physiology. So again, we mentioned before that when they sort of combined, or rather when they had a combined sample of menstrual cycle and oral contraceptives, it sort of made the study a bit more positive because it helped us highlight that it may not be down to hormones, okay, that the performance decrements occur, if anything, okay, because they had differing levels of hormones due to the contraception. However, there were no statistically significant differences. However, it's not necessarily something which you can generalize. And as we get into the point later on about the critical evaluation, this really, really does pose a significant methodological concern when you're looking to generalize, okay, as some people have tried to do in the past. It's potentially inappropriate comparison to fully generalize between menstrual cycle and oral contraceptives due to the differences that they put on female physiology, okay? And then the observations of effects of the menstrual cycle on strength performance warrants further research. A lot of the things you'll read in science will say that it warrants further research because there's always more things to be known. There's always more things to be known. It's not saying that this is always going to be the truth. We might come out with future evidence in the future that states that, it may be worth overhauling, training systems and basing training systems on the menstrual cycle because we now have breakthrough evidence in form of whatever. It's unlikely. It's unlikely based on the evidence base that we have, but it can happen. Nothing is ever certain in science, and this is the thing where science has proved stuff. Science very rarely proves stuff. It just highlights a lot of evidence that seems to show a phenomenon. Okay, that's what a lot of people don't understand. So it's scientifically proven. Typically what they mean is that there's a lot of evidence to back the observations that we're seeing based on XYZ, okay? When we're looking to determine causality and stuff like that, we can have very, very strong, evidence for causality, from things like randomized control trials and meta-analyses and stuff like that. But it's very, very, you'll very rarely hear actual experts use the word proven. Okay, very, very rarely actual experts use the word proven. Typically when they mean proven, it means there's a lot of strong evidence to back it up. That's why a lot of the times you'll hear people say things like, it seems like, it looks like, it's evident that, okay? Very rarely hear people talk in absolutes, okay? As Obi-Wan Kenobi once said, only a Sith deals in absolutes, okay? But anyway, as I said, it warrants further research given the methodological, try saying that 5 times fast, concerns and study quality problems, okay? So more high quality evidence needed. And if any effects of the menstrual cycle appear to be trivial at most, and that mainly means physiological effects, okay? We got a little bit more to go into with regards to psychological impact, however, which I think is going to be very, very important and insightful for you guys. Finally, 3.3, the critical evaluation of menstrual cycle-based training or phase-based training. The support for this is based on the results from 2 studies, which posited that follicular phase training was superior to luteal phase training, and follicular phase training was superior to training for the whole cycle, which is a bit weird. Okay, if you understand anything, for example, about muscle hypertrophy and understand the importance of training volume to muscle hypertrophy, that seems a bit odd. Okay, because you know that there's very likely a dose-response relationship, at least for muscle hypertrophy, okay, between the number of hard sets completed, okay? So, as I said, inherently surprising. However, and this is where we're getting back into those methodological concerns and putting our critical analysis hats on. One study used basal body temperature as its measure of ovulation, which we've already discussed is an inappropriate measure of ovulation. Okay, so it reduces result validity and reliability and ability to distinguish cycle phases. So there you go. Because as I said, ovulation doesn't always come with a concomitant increase in temperature. Okay, it's a very small increase in temperature as well. Obviously, it's quite large on a physiological scale, but it's relatively small. It's 0.5 degree Celsius. So as I said, only really in 22% of cycles. It's not a very good measure of ovulation. As a result, your estimate of menstrual cycle phase is already off. So there's problems from the outset. Finally, then, organizations of training sessions implied, so this is how they structured the training sessions in this study, they implied that all participants ovulated mid-cycle and had perfectly symmetrical cycles, which is very, very unlikely. As you said, there's high variability in the menstrual cycles across the cycle in the same person, and across cycles in different individuals. And this is where structures like this are problematic for this reason of cycle variability. Okay? So, as I said, that further clouds the result validity and usefulness. As I said, the basal body temperature measure also does this. Then in the other study, methodological issues existed in that all training sessions were unsupervised. So then you have the case of, did the participants complete all of the prescribed volume that they were supposed to? Did they do more? Did they do less? Because they were unsupervised and there was no clear progression structure labeled of how they were going to progressively overload these participants. It was basically, completely uncontrolled. Their training, which is something which you need to keep tight control of in order to do a study of this nature, was completely uncontrolled and unsupervised. Okay. Other things like estimating proximity to failure was also not clearly laid out on how they did that. There was lack of consistency in it. So there's a lot of problems with how these studies were conducted that would lead them to these assertions that menstrual cycle phase-based training is superior. Okay. As I said, no standardized progression system. Training program was also based on the perception the menstrual cycle equals exactly 28 days, which, as I said, is an inherent problem, making the false rigidity and consistency assumptions. Okay, so these are big concerns. Second study also did not identify the timing of ovulation. So there's big concerns with these studies. 2 out of 3 were also taking some form of contraceptive. Okay, 2/3 of the people in this study were taking some form of contraceptive. Okay, whether it be monophasic or biphasic, whatever. Okay, and this is where the invalid comparison comes in. Okay, so for making a comparison across menstrual cycles using a participant sample, which is 67% oral contraceptives, an oral pill cycle, is very inappropriate. Okay, only 1/3 of women were going through their natural menstrual cycle on this study, or in this study, rendering the assertion that it should be based on a menstrual cycle, very inappropriate and very, as I said, premature is the word which the authors used. So yeah, the critical evaluation tends to put a lot of scrutiny on phase-based training over just a traditional resistance training approach that progressively overloads over time. Okay. Evidence does not support the notion that phase-based resistance training programs are more effective or necessary for promoting female strength adaptations. That's the last point I'm going to make on this study. So as I said, this study was very, very useful and very, very informative. We're going to be delving more so now. That's a diagram of what the umbrella review looks like. I'll see if I can pod that up in a minute. So the last study we're going to be looking at today is from 2022. It was a study by Dam et al. I think this is going to help fill in a lot of the gaps, okay, to do with, okay, there's no objective physiological base at the moment to say that because of hormone fluctuations, because of, there's no changes in bioavailable testosterone across phases, that there's a strong physiological reason for performance decrements across the menstrual cycle. However, I do want to shed some light on the psychological component, purely because I think it is very, very important to address. Now, what I mean by this is that the physical symptoms of the menstrual cycle, and this is the way I'm thinking about it at the minute, the physical symptoms of the menstrual cycle can have serious negative psychological impacts due to the physical symptoms, okay? So the physical symptoms cause serious negatives psychologically due to the physical symptoms that the athlete is experiencing, and then those psychological decrements result in physical performance decrements. I'll explain what I mean as we go through this study. So, psychological versus physical for performance in the menstrual cycle, okay, is what this study looked at. So, performance heavily correlated with psychological well-being, but not fluctuating hormone levels, okay? So, this group of researchers assessed variations in strength and power across both eumenoric and contraceptive cycles, okay? So again, that helps us distinguish, the difference in hormones due to contraception and stuff like that. Again, like we talked about before, although it's invalid to make assertions for menstrual cycle phase-based programming based on oral contraceptive data, we can sort of highlight that any decrements may not be down to hormones based on similar data, okay? They also looked at psychological and physiological changes. So we had a sample size of 40 normal weight, healthy women. 30 were on their normal menstrual cycle and 10 were on a pill cycle. Okay, that's how I'm going to do it. This is a prospective cohort study. On average, or rather the age gap or the age of the participants was 18 to 35. Okay, so it's got a slightly higher age range as well. 7 to 9 times during the menstrual cycle or the pill cycle. Yeah, I'm just going to call it the cycle for the sake of it. Participants completed testing batteries. So this was physical tests, as we'll go through in a minute. They also completed certain psychological tests, okay? Such as a well-being questionnaire and a visual analog scale of physical discomfort, okay? They also undertook blood sampling, which is how they measured when ovulation occurred, and they also tracked their weight and stuff like that. So the physical tests, they measured maximal isometric strength, which is a maximal strength that a muscle can generate without movement, okay, via hand grip. So think about it, the hand grip dynamometer, you squeeze down as hard as you can on the hand grip and it measures your force output of your squeeze. That measures maximal isometric strength. They measured elbow flexor strength, that's the strength of your biceps. Counter movement jump, and also the Wingate test, again as a measure of power. So you have stretch shortening cycle with the counter movement jump, and you also have just pure anaerobic capacity with the Wingate test. The psychological test, yeah, I said you had the visual analog scale of physical discomfort. I'll try and include an example of what a visual analog scale looks like up by here somewhere. And then you also have what's called a mark on the affect grid. Okay, so the way this works is that it's a single item scale of what's called pleasure and arousal. This is how they measured these two constructs. Pleasure response to training, and the arousal, which is almost like the want to compete. Think about the other connotations which you might use the word arousal in. Think of arousal in the context of sport as being turned on to wanting to compete, okay? You're fired up, okay? You're in a sympathetic state. You're not being blasé about your competition. You're not competing because you have to. When you're aroused, you're there because you want to be there, okay? You're not there because you feel like you have to be or anything like that. You want to do your best. You want to prove to your opponent that you can be better than them, or you are better than them. You're going to dominate them. That's what arousal is. And obviously, if you think about the other context, which you use the word arousal in, it's very similar, just a different context that we're using it in. And they using this, they basically classified them into two broad dimensions. So it was pleasure or displeasure, and then arousal or sleepiness. As I said, think of sleepiness, you turned off; arousal, you turned on. Okay, that's the way you think about it. This test has moderate reliability and validity for determining general pleasure and arousal responses. Okay, so it was an okay test to do. So, as I said, ovulation measured via blood test. This is good. This is a good point because now we have a clear distinction on the phases, and we can know that the participants were measured at the correct phase when it was that time of the phase for them. Okay. Results. Okay, so there was no direct correlation between variations in sex hormones and physical parameters. Okay, so for example, there was no correlation between an increase in, there was no negative correlation, for example, between an increase in progesterone. So say you've got progesterone going across the x-axis, you've got performance going across the y-axis. I think it's going to be backwards on the camera, but the higher the progesterone, the lower the performance. We didn't see that. Okay, there was no correlations in hormones and performance. However, there was positive correlations observed between physical performance and psychological well-being. Okay. And also self-reported motivation. Okay, so think of self-reported motivation like that arousal. Yeah. So also perceptions of one's own physical performance, pleasure, and arousal levels. Okay, so all of these psychological components of what we're looking at when it comes to sports performance were heavily correlated with sporting success, sporting performance across the menstrual cycle, but the hormones were not. Okay, so what this led to, wind gate power was 3% lower in the early follicular phase versus the mid-luteal phase. So the early phase, when you're menstrual bleeding and when you're having your cramps and your aches and your irritability and stuff like that, wind gate power was 3% lower relative to the mid towards the end of the phase. Then you have the average power was 2 to 5% lower in the late luteal phase compared to all other menstrual cycle phases. So just before you hit that early follicular phase where you start your menstrual bleeding, that's where you're getting your sort of small decrement in average power. Counter movement jump was 6% lower in the late luteal phase versus the mid luteal phase. Just remember, you're starting to lose that support in the endothelium. You're starting to enter that phase where you're starting to get into the early follicular phase. You're about to start menstrual bleeding. You start to notice a decrease in counter movement jump performance. Again, that might be because you start experiencing some of the physical changes that lead to the psychological decrements. Okay. Physical pain was higher in the early follicular phase and late luteal phases. So in that late luteal phase, you start experiencing more pain. That's going to decrease your want to compete. That's going to decrease your perception of your own performance. That's going to decrease your perceived confidence and stuff like that. Finally, then, you have pleasure from competition was down in the early follicular phase versus the early luteal and mid luteal, and arousal levels were also lower in the early follicular phase as opposed to the mid luteal phase. So this is all really, really important to consider. And this is where I said psychological factors resulting from the physical symptoms of the menstrual cycle may play a larger role than changes in sex hormones. And I really do think that they do. I think things like the physical pain, the increased sensation of DOMS, the increased notability of backaches and headaches, the menstrual cramps, the menstrual bleeding, sleep disturbances, mood disturbances, all of these different things have the negative effects of reducing your perception of your own performance, reducing your want to compete, reducing your pleasure response from competing and training. And as a result, that brings these performance characteristics down. I think that is exactly what happens. Okay. I think that's what happens with most people. As I said, loss of arousal and pleasure, greater pain sensations, headaches, backaches, cramps, and menstrual bleeding. As I said, the other things where you have your loss of want to compete and your loss of arousal, your loss of pleasure response, all characterize the early follicular and late luteal phases, which is where we notice most of these performance decrements. They may have a greater impact on subsequent performance. There's more data on trends across multiple cycles needed to confirm this, but I think there's strong evidence to support that based on that there doesn't seem to be a strong rationale for hormonal changes being the responsible for the negative consequences of the menstrual cycle that we see in terms of these performance drops coming down. But I think it's that the menstrual cycle is so draining on female athletes and on female gym goers, for example, just due to the negative effects of it, the increase. And I've mentioned all these. I'll mention them one more time as we're summing up the whole overall evidence, stuff like that. We'll go into my overall sum up in a minute. But I think these are very strong predictors of success. I think if you can address these, you'll have better performances across the various stages of the menstrual cycle. But all of these physical symptoms result in these psychological decrements, these psychological decreases where you don't want to compete. You don't get the same pleasure response from training. Your self-reported motivation is lower due to you being in pain, you bleeding, you having cramps, your headaches, your mood's all over the place. You didn't sleep great last night. All of these things have negative impacts on training and recovery due to the menstrual cycle. They drain you psychologically. And they obviously physically as well. And as a result, you end up with decreased performance. I think if you can address these things, though, you'll be able to mitigate the damage, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to try and include this graphic. I've got a little graphic here on my tablet, which I'd like to pop up somewhere here, which you can sort of see how I thought about it when I was writing it down. I've got a little graphic which I can use to illustrate what I'm trying to say. And this is where I think that, especially if you're a coach, you need to be knowledgeable and empathetic of the menstrual cycle and understand what your female clients and athletes are going through when it comes to their menstrual cycle. It's not a pleasant time for them. Okay, if they're still showing up, they're still training, they're still trying to do their best, then that should be appreciated. Okay, You know, a lot of the attitudes of men who may not understand the menstrual cycle can be to just completely, you know, diminish or respect for it, show no respect for it. Oh, she's just being moody. She's just being this. Oh my God. No, actually show respect. I show respect for the women going through the menstrual cycle at this point in time. It's not pleasant for them, you know, and they're trying to still turn up and train despite that. They're particularly, you know, quote unquote grumpy on one day. Try to do your best to be empathetic with that. Okay. You know, it's not necessarily that you need to overhaul the entire session. It's not that you need to baby them. If anything, I'd say that's being a little bit patronizing. But, you know, don't be disrespectful. Don't be a douchebag. They're still trying to turn up and do their best, despite the physical pain that they're in, and despite their loss of motivation, their loss of want to train, their loss of arousal, and their loss of pleasure response to training. You know, appreciate that they're still turning up. Okay, especially if you're a coach, especially if you're, you know, somebody who coaches females. And, you know, if you're a female athlete as well, take respect for yourself in that as well, in the sense that you don't want to turn up to train. You don't want to, you know, you're not getting a great pleasure response from training. You're not wanting to train. You know, your perception of your own physical performance is down. You know, you're in pain. You didn't sleep great last night, but you still turned up. You still turned up because this goal matters to you. This goal matters to you, and that should be appreciated. That should be praised. Okay, because you didn't give up despite the circumstances. It would have been easy to sit on the couch and feel sorry for yourself and all stuff like that, because you know you've got these pains and you've got these disturbances and stuff like that. But no, you still chose to turn up to the gym to better yourself in some way, and that should be respected. Okay, I respect you guys for that. But overall thoughts on the evidence that I have presented today. And obviously you guys can debate this and message me and everything like that. Share your thoughts on the episode. Please do. I'm always open to feedback and stuff like that. If you've got anything which you'd like to add to the you know, the episode, if you've got any further evidence to add, you know what I mean? Please do, like, you know, get at me on my socials and stuff like that. Leave comments, you know, leave stuff down in the Q&A box down below, whatever it is. But the overall thought is that there's no compelling evidence overall to conclude that the menstrual cycle has direct physiological decrements in terms of hormone fluctuations is what I mean by that. Okay, I mean hormone fluctuations on strength performance and on resistance exercise training performance. Okay, hormonal fluctuations do not appear to be responsible for it. In my opinion, negative effects may more so be a result of symptoms of the menstrual cycle on female athletes psychologically and physiologically, affecting their desire to train and compete, affecting their pleasure response from training and competition, affecting their own perception, as I said, of their training and of their own abilities, affecting their confidence and their perceived self-competence. When measured, when measured, there is no strong evidence that suggest direct physical decrement. Okay. Important to consider as well is a support network. Okay, if you don't have a good support network and you're a female coach, a female trainee, for example, with a male coach, and they don't seem to be supporting you through it, then that's informative for you as well. Okay, either just see if they're just ignorant, as in they don't know, or if they're arrogant and they don't care. That will help you inform your future decisions. Okay, having an empathetic coaching staff. And again, empathetic doesn't mean that they're going to baby you. Empathetic doesn't mean that they're going to baby you at all. It just means that they understand what your body's going through at this present time. Okay, and they may adjust their coaching style accordingly. They're more military and authoritarian. Normally, they might, you know, change up and be just a little bit more empathetic. You know, I said, especially males, who should be thoroughly educated in the individuality of the menstrual cycle and its effects. In my opinion, this is important for combating the drop in arousal, because a support network can help you still want to do your best. It can help sort of you get that want to compete back. If you've got a trainer that you can see clearly wants to push you, he's being empathetic with how he is, but he still clearly wants to push you, then that might give you that little bit of extra confidence, a little bit of extra boost to still say, no, you know what, we can push yourself and get yourself fired up a little bit more. If that coach inspires you, okay, they should be inspiring you to always want to do your best. Okay, the coach is putting you down and you probably need a new goddamn coach. But anyway, a coach should always be inspiring you to do your best, and they may be able to help you overcome that hump if, you know, they're empathetic and they want to see you do your best. Okay, so good coaching and empathetic coaching can help them combat this drop in arousal, this motivation, and this desire to train, and maybe help get that little bit of pleasure back from the training at a time where, you know, the female physiology is not treating the female well, okay, so to speak. And then better chance of performance and training quality being maintained and moving you towards your longer term goals still being maintained, okay? I said, my view, and this is what I said colored my research, so to speak, and my reading on the background reading of this topic, so to speak, is that I changed my perception of the menstrual cycle. And personally, I'd like people to see it as another obstacle to overcome, okay? Not as a reason to stop and fall, as another obstacle to overcome, okay? You know, I think if somebody's still training as hard as they can, despite that, and pushing themselves through it, exercising, discipline, and you know, still trying to move themselves forward in a positive direction, despite all the negative physiological symptoms of the menstrual cycle, I think that's really, really inspiring, really, really powerful. Okay, so keep doing that. See it as an obstacle, and see it as one you're going to run the fuck through. You're going to run the fuck over because you're tough. You don't go down easy. Okay? But anyway, as I said, training may have to be slightly altered if the symptoms are particularly severe. I'm not saying that we should never change, you know, training. You can change training for whatever reason. If you decided that today is going to go be your client's 1 rep max day, but then the clients come in, they've had 2 hours sleep because their kid's been keeping them up all night and all stuff like that, and they absolutely like this in the gym. You know, for those who can't see right now, just making a, you know, like a nearly dead face, you know. They like this in the gym. Maybe not the best day to do a 1 rep max squat. Okay, so you change it accordingly. You may have to make slight changes accordingly. That's okay. You can still keep them moving in a positive direction. Okay, maybe you change exercise selection. Maybe you change a rep range and go a little bit higher reps for more reps and more sets. Increase the training volume without necessarily increasing the weight up to super high levels. Okay, there's many ways that you can change the training program to accommodate this. And then when a client is coming in and they're super motivated or they're super aroused and they want to do their best, then fuck it, let's go chuck some weight on the bar. You know what I mean? Don't necessarily have to do it when they're at their worst. Okay. And as I said, you should always strive to do your best, despite the circumstances. So that is nearly an hour and 20 minutes of me talking about the menstrual cycle. Yeah, like, interested to see the feedback on this one. The world is a particularly hot bed at the minute, or some people see the world as a bit of a hotbed where some people can talk about things and others can't. But anyway, I hope that answers the question, at least presently, of, you know, the evidence surrounding training for the menstrual cycle, if we should, you know, drastically modify training based on the menstrual cycle, all stuff like that. You know, I think it's very, very important to consider all the backgrounds, you know, the physiological background, the psychological background, which I feel that we went into in quite a lot of detail here. Obviously, there's always more that can be done. I had to draw the line somewhere. Maybe we'll do a follow-up episode later on in the future. You know, maybe there'll be more evidence that'll come out in the future. You know, I'm quite good at keeping up to date with new evidence that's coming out and stuff like that. So we shall see. But I hope you found this episode useful, guys, as I do think you'll find it especially useful if you're a male coach or if you're a female athlete or female gym goer who wants to understand how the menstrual cycle affects their strength performance a little bit more, and why, for example, in certain phases of the menstrual cycle, you might be feeling off. You might be feeling that you don't want to train so much. You might be feeling that you're not getting the same response as you do from training as you did. You know, you're not getting the same pleasure response. You don't walk away from the gym feeling as good as you normally do. You don't turn up to the gym feeling as good as you normally do. That's okay. It's perfectly natural. You're still turning up to the gym. You're still putting the work in. You're still doing what you can. And that's what matters. So I hope you enjoyed that episode, guys. I hope you found it useful. Please leave your feedback as always. Obviously, share it with your friends, share it with your family, whoever, if you think it might be useful. As I said, hope you had a great new year. Hope you had a great time celebrating another successful revolution around the big celestial body known as the sun, in this, you know, constellation known as the solar system that we are a part of, or in the system as the solar system that we know we are a part of, within, you know, the Milky Way galaxy that is within the something supercluster, that is within the Laniakea supercluster, that is within the local group, and I think I got those all out of order, but that is within the observable universe, which is in probably the age of the infinite and all stuff like that. Anyway, I'm getting on a major tangent. Anyway, I need to end this episode somewhere, so I'm going to end it now. As I said, I hope you had a great time, guys. I hope you had a great time listening. Please leave your feedback as always. Can't wait to catch you again soon. Happy New Year. Out.